Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The Prime Minister has hit back after Labour accused the government of being callous and incompetent in its treatment of the so-called Windrush generation. In the Commons this lunchtime, Theresa May again apologised to those wrongly threatened with deportation. During an exchange with the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, she said she wouldn't take lessons from a leader who, in her words, allows anti-Semitism to run rife in his party. Our political editor Laura Kunsberg reports.
That was a long time ago. Yeah, that veranda, I used to slide down there.
Jamaica, country of his birth. Britain, country of his home. Nick Broderick came to London as a toddler with his mother and sister in the late 1950s. But decades later, he says he was threatened with deportation and even lost his job.
1 minute, I'm going back to a country now as a little boy I know nothing about. As far as I know, this is my home.
All because under tightened immigration rules, he couldn't prove he had the legal right to live here.
I don't think people have realised the mental pressure it puts you under to have this on you. You feel like a criminal. It's awful. It really is awful. I've always worked and looked after my family. That's what a man does. But not like this, Especially when you think there's no one there and I couldn't afford a lawyer.
Are you to blame for the Windrush fiasco, Prime Minister?
She was in charge at the Home Office for years when the laws became stricter and stricter. But the Prime Minister has apologised again because the Windrush generation should never have been caught up in the changes.
These people are British. They are part of us. And I want to be absolutely clear. That we have no intention of asking anyone to leave who has the right to remain here.
But what happened to records that could have avoided at least part of the problem?
In 2010, the Home Office destroyed landing cards for a generation of Commonwealth citizens, and so have told people, we can't find you in our system. Did the Prime Minister, the then Home Secretary, sign off that decision?
Prime Minister.
No, the decision to destroy the landing cards was taken in 2009 under a Labour government.
The decision was taken by officials, not ministers. But the anxiety of those affected goes way beyond paperwork.
The Windrush generation came to our country after the war to rebuild our nation that had been so devastated by war. Isn't the truth? Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that under her, the Home Office became heartless and hopeless?
Was it Theresa May?
Good morning. Well, this Home Secretary has to deal with an accidental mess. The overall crackdown under the former Home Secretary was entirely deliberate. Listen to this.
We want to ensure that only legal migrants have access to the labour market, free health services, housing, bank accounts and driving licences. And this is not just about making the UK a more hostile place for illegal migrants, it is also about fairness.
The intense push by the government had eyebrow-raising tactics, but ministers believed the Home Office had hefty public support.
If you haven't got all of the right paperwork, you're basically a bad guy, and they have a culture of disbelief. And their absolute commitment since 2010 has been trying to cut immigration and drive as many people as they can out of the country. And I think it's that cultural assumption which has driven a lot of the problems we've seen around the Windrush generation.
Consequences that weren't intended, but weren't random either. Anxiety for thousands of people for whom Britain was and is a place called home.
Now, this problem has been building here at the Home Office for quite some time, but I'm told it's only really in the last couple of weeks that the pattern has really become obvious to those who work at the senior level here in this government department. This mess was not created on purpose, but it is a byproduct over efforts to tighten the immigration rules again and again over a period of many years. Rightly or wrongly, those decisions were taken by ministers and the Home Office, and they believed at the time they had significant public support.
Laura Kunsberg, thank you.
There were ugly clashes in the House of Commons today as the Prime Minister and the Labour leader argued over the plight of the Windrush generation. Theresa May made a second apology over the row in as many days, but she tried to deflect criticism, claiming a decision to destroy migrants' landing cards was made whilst Labour were in power. Jeremy Corbyn hit back, accusing Mrs May of overseeing a callous and incompetent government, which he said had caused pain for a whole generation. Here's our political correspondent Romilly Weeks on the blame game.
Just how culpable is Theresa May over the plight of the children who emigrated legally from British colonies in the Caribbean and made their home in the UK as part of the Windrush generation?
Questions to the Prime Minister.
Home Secretary when the immigration rules hardened in 2014 and now presiding over the fallout, she came to the Commons to apologise yet again.
For those who have mistakenly received letters challenging them, I want to say apologise to them, and I want to say sorry to anyone who has confusion or anxiety felt as a result of this.
Jeremy Corbyn tried to lay the blame squarely at her door.
Yesterday we learnt that in 2010 the Home Office destroyed landing cards for a generation of Commonwealth citizens, and so have told people we can't find you in our system. Did the Prime Minister, the then Home Secretary, sign off that decision?
Prime Minister.
No, the decision to destroy the landing cards was taken in 2009 under a Labour government.
Pulling that rabbit out of a hat delighted Tory backbenchers, but it backfired minutes later when her spokesperson admitted it was officials at the border agency, not Labour ministers, who'd made the decision.
Many of those coming ashore were wives and children of men already working here.
The destruction of the landing cards is important because many of the Windrush children arrived on their parents' passports. The landing slips key documentary proof of their provenance.
Often it's the only record those people have. The landing card is essentially a form of identity for them in terms of who they are and when they arrived, and it's highly regrettable that they were destroyed.
This afternoon the Prime Minister was giving a warm welcome to the Canadian President. The question of why the welcome the Windrush citizens should have enjoyed was so cruelly withdrawn is one that's causing the Prime Minister huge damage. Romilly Weeks, ITV News.
The government insists none of the Windrush generation now face the threat of deportation. But that's scant consolation to those who say their lives have already been ruined. One former child migrant has been telling our correspondent Ben Chapman how he has lost everything.
Thank you, sir.
He has lived and worked here for 50 years. But for the last 4, Renford McIntyre has had to beg the kindness of friends for almost every meal. He lost his job and then his home, his only fault being unable to prove he has the right to stay here.
I went to school. I went to Dudley Technical College. I've worked all my life. Why am I not entitled to something back out the kitty what I have paid in? Tell me, please. This is where I'm at now.
He was sleeping rough until a friend offered to pay for this tiny room. He couldn't apply for a job, housing or benefits. After sending the Home Office a briefcase full of documents going back 50 years, he's finally been granted the residency permit he was entitled to all along.
Do you feel like you've been let down?
Yes, very much so. Somebody's out there taking the proverbial. I'm having to ask families and friends to do my washing. It drives me mad. I like to get up and go and earn some money.
But he knows that putting his life back together won't be quick or easy, and he wants compensation for the years he can't get back.
I don't want nothing for nothing. I just want some of what I paid in the kitty back.
Because it's a long road back for you now.
It is at my age, at 64. You're talking about, well, what can I do again? Them 4 years I've lost.
It has been a degrading and humiliating experience for a man proud to call Britain his home. And though his case may have been resolved, his future has not. Ben Chapman, ITV News, Dudley.
OK, well, let's return to our political correspondent, Romilly Weeks in Westminster. Romilly, it's a really distressing story, that. Renford's story does show, doesn't it, that this is by far no way over for the Prime Minister.
Absolutely, Mary. The Prime Minister said today these people are British. They are part of this. Well, you listen to Renford's story and you think, what a way to treat them. What his story shows is that this is not just an issue of deportation. The Prime Minister has promised that no one will now be threatened with deportation. But the crackdown that came about in the Home Office between 2014 and 2016 on immigration caused serious damage to Windrush citizens, jobs, homes, even access to healthcare. And the person who presided over that crackdown, who created this hostile environment for immigration, was one Theresa May. The Home Office has said in the last few minutes that 113 people have now contacted the helpline set up to help Windrush citizens. MPs have told me that they fear the true number will be far higher than that.
OK, Romilly Weeks at Westminster, thank you.
The mother of a Windrush child has called on Theresa May to reflect upon what she is doing to the country after her 58-year-old son was found dead last month. The cause of his death is still being determined. Dexter had spent more than a year trying to prove his right to live in the UK, a country he hadn't left since he arrived here as a child from Grenada in the 1960s. Because he didn't have the right documentation, he'd lost his job and was warned he could be deported. Our senior Home Affairs correspondent Simon Israel has his story.
Dexter Bristol was found dead 3 weeks ago. He was 58 and had lived in the UK virtually all his life. He was one of thousands of Windrush children. He arrived on his mother's British passport issued in Grenada when he was 8 years old. His last year was spent having to try to prove he was British.
We are not foreigners. We were born British, and I am British. Dexter was British. So is all my family British. We know no one else when we were growing up. No other country, England.
But not British in the eyes of the Home Office.
That's right, yeah. That's right.
Dexter's mother had been a nurse in the NHS for nearly 40 years. She describes her son as a quiet, thoughtful, intelligent man who had never done anything wrong. But she noticed a significant change last year.
Well, he was depressed. Dexter was very depressed over the whole situation. Very depressed.
When he kept on and on about this passport and needing
well, he said if he don't get his passport, they could cut off his benefit. He's going to lose his flat, and he can't afford to do that.
The 2014 changes to immigration laws left Dexter Bristol with a mountain to climb.
His work, he'd been sacked from his job. He'd been a cleaner and he'd been sacked.
Because?
Because he had no proof of his status. And this is the thing that's been happening. You know, employers, doctors, schools, universities, you name it, have been asking people to prove their status as a result of the 2014 Act. And he was one of those.
She was tasked with trawling through countless records to try to prove a negative. That Dexter Bristol had never left the UK since he was a Windrush child.
We went looking for primary school records. His primary school had closed down. He went to 2 different secondary schools. One of those had closed down and the other one's now a very posh golf club and hotel. We then contacted DWP for his work records, found work records, but they only go back in digital form to 1976. So that was a real problem.
That was not enough.
That was not enough.
Still not enough.
Still not enough. And even though Dexter was here as a child, having arrived in 1968, age 8, we thought, well, there'll be medical records, because we have found medical records in some of these cases. But with Dexter, his medical records only went back to the 80s.
In the week before Easter, there was a breakthrough. His lawyer wrote to her client saying they had found a way to prove he qualified as a British passport holder.
So we wrote to him on the Thursday before Good Friday.
And on Good Friday?
We heard he died. He died on the Thursday night. He never got our letter.
He never got the letter?
He never got the letter. And we copied the letter to his mother, and she got it.
Never learned of the possible breakthrough?
Never learned of the possible breakthrough in writing.
The changes pledged by the government, the offer of help to find information, the promise that no Windrush child will be deported, have all come too late for Dexter Bristol.
Very unfair. I mean, a child come to this country 8 years old and spend 50 years. This is their home. Very unfair.
Do you feel angry?
Very, very angry. I cannot put my words together right now because my mind is not with me. You know.
I understand.
I'm not normally like that, you know that, Jackie. I'm not normally like that, you know. But I'm very, very angry, and I'm grieving at the moment. I'm frustrated. Everything is happening to my life right now. And Miss Theresa May should have another look at the situation she commit in this country, well, if that's the right word, the situation she creates in this country for the Caribbean and even the Africans, for foreigners. You know, she should have another look and she should be ashamed of herself. And all the other MPs that is on her side, they should be ashamed of themselves because we are human beings. I would not accept myself as a foreigner. I'm not a foreigner. This is my home.
This was the first bit of evidence that we got that showed him being here in 1974.
Okay.
Like many other cases, Dexter Bristol's was not simple, but the onus was always on him to find documents from his past.
Yes.
The Home Office has yet to respond.
Well, the Windrush generation dominated Prime Minister's questions today. Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn argued furiously about who was responsible for the destruction of the original landing cards that could have helped some Commonwealth citizens prove their right to remain in Britain. Jeremy Corbyn blamed Theresa May for running a callous and incompetent government. Theresa May apologised to anyone who had mistakenly received letters questioning their right to remain in Britain. This evening, the Home Office says a total of 113 people have called the government hotline set up for members of the Windrush generation. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
Together, the Commonwealth leaders, getting royally welcomed in London this week, govern a third of the world's population. The Windrush story was not what Theresa May wanted them to be reading about when they got here. In the Commons today, Theresa May gave a public apology to members of the Windrush generation who'd been threatened with deportation and made anxious through questioning of their right to stay here. Jeremy Corbyn tried to put Mrs May on the spot for the actions of her old department.
Yesterday we learnt that in 2010 the Home Office destroyed landing cards for a generation of Commonwealth citizens and so have told people we can't find you in our system. Did the Prime Minister, the then Home Secretary, sign off that decision?
A tight smile warned something was up.
No, the decision to destroy the landing cards was taken in 2009 under a Labour government.
Tories jeered the Labour leader, a mixture of excitement and relief after what could have been a mauling for their leader.
All the evidence here.
The Labour leader was wrong-footed by the discovery here that the decision to destroy landing cards taken by the UK Border Agency actually happened a year earlier than had previously been thought. So in 2009 under a Labour government, not in 2010 when the Tories had come in, though Number 10 said it was taken by officials, this decision, not politicians. Nonetheless, Labour said the Home Secretary should resign for the actions of her department on her watch. And some Tory critics of Amber Rudd have been only too happy to join in with that chorus. Many, it has to be said, Brexiteers who want to bring this pro-Remain politician down a peg or down altogether. Amber Rudd attacked her own department on Monday for losing sight of individuals. But the Home Office today rejected claims made in the European Parliament that the Windrush affair was proof the department wouldn't cope with registering EU citizens after Brexit.
After the Windrush Scandal in Britain, we want to be sure that the same is not happening to our European citizens and that there is no bureaucratic nightmare there.
Doesn't she now run a government that is both callous and incompetent?
I will not take an accusation of callous from a man who allows anti-Semitism to run rife in his party.
After exchanges like that, some Commonwealth leaders might wonder where they've landed. Global Britain might not be the first phrase that comes to mind.
Gary Gibbon. Well, the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott, joins us now. Diane Abbott, this programme has been pursuing this story about the Windrush children, well, for the last 3 or 4 months, and haven't heard Labour on this until literally the last few weeks. Have you done enough, do you think?
We raised this question in Prime Minister's question some months ago, and I've been working on the issue, so tomorrow we're going to have a big meeting at the House of Commons with people I've been working with, victims, lawyers, the community. We have been working on this issue.
But if we'd had this row 4 months ago, the life of Dexter Bristol might have been saved.
But we had this row, and
well, we're having it now. We weren't having it then.
As I said, the leader raised this in Prime Minister's questions, and Theresa May brushed it aside. But I think we need to be thinking of what it's meant to these people to have this uncertainty, this humiliation. Some of them are in detention centres now. I've met them just because they're the Windrush generation and couldn't produce their papers.
Well, what do you say to Dexter's mother?
I think it's for Theresa May to speak to Dexter's mother. I've been very clear on this issue, and I've worked with a group of people on this issue for months.
You see, the issue of the landing cards, it wasn't until 2 years later, 3 years later, in fact, that the landing cards became relevant because the law was changed to force people to reveal their arrival circumstances. And so one wonders why your leader went on that when he should really have gone on the change of the law, which brought about this predicament.
Well, I think the Tories were wrong to jeer at the landing cards issue. I think it comes back to people's lives. This is my mother's generation. They've been treated in a shameful way all across the Commonwealth. This is a front page story today. And I think we need to concentrate on the people who have suffered. I think the Home Office needs to bring forward the statistics. They are able to find out how many are in detention, and they ought to know how many have been deported. And also, this idea that...
Well, how are you going to force those facts out of them?
Well, one of my colleagues put in a written question in January asking to know how many people in this situation had been deported or were in detention. And the Home Office wrote back and said they couldn't find these figures out without disproportionate cost. I'm saying at this point they need to bear the cost because we need to have the figures.
Well, now, the Home Secretary has said that she's going to try and bring about solutions to people's problems here within 2 weeks of discovering them. I mean, what assistance are you giving her to reveal names that you have that conceivably she can work on?
We're giving her every assistance, and we've also worked on individual cases for at least a year. But what I would say, this idea that she's going to resolve cases in 2 months, the Home Office can't organise to open an envelope in 2 months. I believe it when I see it. What the Home Secretary needs to do, instead of blaming her officials, is give officials the discretion they haven't had up to now. What we want is an arrangement which deals with these people as a cohort rather than expecting frightened people to come forward.
But this is a massive crisis because it's going to affect many other people. There's the danger in the end that it might affect 3 million European people living here after Brexit. I mean, how quickly... It seems to me everyone's moving at a very lethargic pace.
No. The Labour Party hasn't moved at a lethargic pace. We are not the government. I have met with European nationals because obviously we're having to look at the situation post-Brexit. And even before this, they were concerned about the Home Office's capacity to process their cases, particularly partners and children. And this is just going to make their fears worse.
Now, you said this morning that the Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, should consider her position. Do you want her to resign?
I wouldn't put it like that, but there was a time, which you will remember, when things went as badly wrong as this in a government department, the minister offered their resignation.
Now, one of the other problem that your party has been dealing with has been anti-Semitism within the party. What do you say to those who criticised your leader for tolerating anti-Semitism within the party, because he's still under fire for it?
Jeremy's never tolerated anti-Semitism, and he's not an anti-Semite. But we had some really tragic speeches last night in the debate, and we, under a new General Secretary, have stepped up our efforts to process these cases. It's been a ridiculously lengthy time to just process the cases, but also we're looking at working with groups like the Jewish Labour Movement to offer training and advice, because on the one hand, we abhor anti-Semitism. One anti-Semite in the Labour Party is one.
Well, give us a deadline. When are you going to have this fixed?
Well, under the new General Secretary, we've made more progress than we made in a long time.
Are we talking about a month, 2 months?
We are talking about accelerating the process, because after all...
I mean, you're calling on the Home Secretary to accelerate the process of Windrush, but on anti-Semitism, you seem also to be having a very long and interminable process.
Please don't imply, John, that the leader of the Labour Party is an anti-Semite. There have been terrible bureaucratic
implying
problems.
the party's jolly slow about weeding it out.
Yeah, that's why we've got a new General Secretary,
Right.
and it's all going to be a lot faster.
OK, well, Kristen, thank you very much for coming.
Well, let's return now to the whole question of the Windrush generation and what has happened to them during this particular controversy, scandal, some people say. I'm joined now by Mary-Ann Seagart, journalist and chair of the Social Market Foundation think tank, by the grime artist Marcy Phonics, and from Westminster by the Conservative MP and historian Kwasi Kwarteng. Marcy Phonics, you're wearing a No Blacks, No Dogs, No Irish T-shirt, which is partly a reference to one of your own works, but it's also obviously the sign that used to be up in the windows during the 50s and 60s.
Of course.
For landlords.
Yeah.
Do you see what's happened to the Windrush generation as about racism?
Of course, there's no doubt about it. I mean, for example, me wearing this right now, this is some merch that we wore in our latest video, which actually consists of black guys and white guys who both believe that actually, even though these signs are down in these windows as we see, they're still very much up.
The racism is still there.
Yeah, these signs are still up in the hearts of these people.
Why do you think this particular outrage, as many people see it, is the product of racism?
Well, it is simply just because, as we all know, we've been speaking about the Windrush for the last few days. Everyone knows why our people came over. They were coming over to fix a nation that was destroyed by the Blitz. We've come, we've helped, we've built it back, but yet we're the only people that get stripped of our citizenization, sorry.
Citizenship,
Sorry.
yeah.
Our citizenship. So we get stripped of that. We've come over, we've helped, we've built back the nation, and we get stripped of that. But yet, you know, I think if it was the other way around, and it was white people, and this isn't just a straight black and white, but I think if it was the other way around, that would never happen. And the reason why I say that is because Great Britain, being so great, we're definitely a nation that keep all our documents. We get told from birth, your national insurance number, your birth certificate, your passport, all these things, they're 100% documented in this Great Britain. And now they've lost our documents.
Mary-Ann Seagart, when all the victims are black, isn't it obvious that there's racism at play here?
Well, I can't believe the government's had such a tin ear about this. I mean, they've really dug themselves a horrible hole, and I should think most people in Britain have an enormous amount of sympathy for these, you know, poor Windrush people who've been here since they were kids. But I think you have to distinguish between racism and anti-immigration feeling. And there's been a huge rise in this country in opposition to immigration. And it's so high now that 75% of people say they want to restrict immigration.
That's what led to the hostile environment.
Exactly, which is what led to the hostile environment. And a lot of that was anti-white immigrants from other parts of Europe. So it's not necessarily a racist thing. And if you look at figures on racism...
Just xenophobic.
Yeah, well, yes, maybe more xenophobic. Well, certainly people worried about the effect on the economy, which actually is a positive one, but a lot of people think it's negative. But if you look at statistics on racism, say, for instance, about 30 years ago, 60% of white people, said that they would mind if a close relative married a black or Asian person. Now it's only 20%. So I think actually, on the human level, there's been a real decline in racism, but at the sort of collective
So only 1 in 5
level,
of people are racist?
Yeah, but, well, 20...
Pretty bad, isn't it?
Pretty bad, but that also means that, you know, 80% aren't. Yeah.
Marcy, what do you say to that?
Well, I would say, you know, sometimes if I go to a bistro pub, I get the energy and the vibe that, you know, even a nice fluffy dog is more welcome than a black man today. That's what I think.
That's really sad, and I really don't want to deny that racism exists. And obviously, if you are of a different ethnic background, then you're going to notice it much more than I.
But you are denying it, aren't you?
I didn't deny it exists.
But if you're saying this scandal isn't to do with racism, even though all its victims are from the Caribbean and are black, then that is denying whatever you want to call it, institutional racism, structural racism, the fact that the system is stacked against these people who are all black.
Well, it's about anti-immigration, and it will also catch lots of white people in its net. And therefore, as we were saying earlier, it's much more... Because you've got to prove that you've lived in this country for a certain number of years in order to be...
But they can't prove it because the documents have been deleted.
I know that's true. But what I'm saying is it definitely wasn't aimed at those Windrush people. It was aimed generically at people who, the Home Office, who are being ridiculously strict about this, believe haven't got a right to be here. So they say everyone has to prove they have a right to be here. It so happens that the people who've been caught by it are these people who've lived in this country all their lives and haven't got enough documents.
Let me bring in Kwasi Kwarteng from Westminster. Do you think there is structural racism or institutional racism within the British immigration system?
I don't think this issue, this scandal, as you called it, or problem is about that. I think we're muddling lots of different things. I think you're right to suggest, your interview was right to suggest that we still do have problems with racism in this country. I also think Marianne Sieghart was right to say that there is the wider debate about immigration is not just a black and white issue, but those things are not really central to what's gone on with the Windrush.
Just address my question.
That's
my
not
question
really
is
central.
there
No,
institutional racism
forgive me.
within the system?
Forgive me. I'm trying to answer a question relating not only to yours but to this Windrush issue. Now, with regard to that,
I don't want you to answer another question, Kwasi. I want you to answer my question.
I think it was administrative blunder. I don't think there's institutional racism of the type you've described. I think socially there are issues. I think lots of people do have certain issues with race. But as Marianne said in her segment, it's a much different, a much better picture than was the case 30 years ago. I mean, I'm 42. I remember what was going on 30 years ago. And I can tell you that the situation, though not perfect today, is much better than it was 30 years ago. And we're also celebrating, or rather commemorating, the 25th anniversary of the appalling murder of Stephen Lawrence. And it's a good time to take stock and look at how British society has evolved in those 25 years. Now, I'm not saying that we're in a perfect state, but I think we're in a much better place than certainly was the case. That's precisely why I'm raising certainly than was the case in 1993. And
the question of institutional racism.
To your specific question, which I've already answered and said, I don't think this is a question of institutional racism in government institutions or in the civil service. And I've said, and I'll say it again, I don't think that's
so it's just a coincidence they're all black?
No, well, you've just gone through this. We've said that the Windrush was all from one part of the world. It came from largely the Caribbean. And so many people were of Afro-Caribbeans. Now, the Prime Minister said very clearly today that people who came before 1973 haven't got a problem at all. And in fact, in most cases, the vast majority have documentation. For those who don't have documentation, the Home Office has actually undertaken to look into it and to sort this problem out.
Okay,
there is no question. There is no question that the people who came on the Windrush and in the generation after that are as British as anyone else and have an absolute right to stay. And the Prime Minister
it's just that the Home Office and all the agencies have been questioning it.
The Prime Minister and the Home Secretary.
Let me just bring in Marcy Phonics.
I know you've cut me off, but the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary.
Well, you've had a long go, and I will come back to you.
Have said that they have a right to stay.
Let me bring in Marcy Phonics. What do you feel about that answer?
Kwasi.
Kwasi.
Well, sorry, mate. If your mum was sent back because her documents, she couldn't provide them because they've been deleted, what would you have to say? I think you'd be standing in a different position right now.
I'd be appalled at that, but there's no, we don't actually, of course I would be, I'd be very upset, but there's no question, we don't even know what's been happening. We don't know how many have been forcibly deported. We don't know that. So
we do know.
I'm not going to stand here, I'm not going to, well, you
we don't, as the public, we don't know the numbers.
Well, one's too many, isn't it? Come on.
Of course it is, but I don't, there's no evidence for this having happened, and I need to see evidence, I need to see numbers.
There's no evidence of what having happened.
Well, all I would say is what the government's position is. We cannot say what the numbers are. We don't know what the numbers are. We've been clear about that. But what we are clear
You just said there's no evidence of this having happened.
What we are certain about is that people who have come from the Windrush have an absolute right to stay, and they're as British as anyone else. We've reiterated that many, many times. And you're just trying to play politics with us. We're just trying to
I'm not a politician. I'm speaking for all the people who come from where I come from. Yeah, I'm sorry to cut you. I can't do politics with you because I'm not a politician. However, I can speak for my people and where we come from. And what I will say to this is, Mate, you're talking nonsense. You know you're talking nonsense because they would keep record of every single person they've deported. The numbers are there. We don't have the numbers. You do. And that's the end of it, mate.
Well,
it's not a question of numbers anyway. It's a question of principle, isn't it?
Yeah, one's enough. You said it. One is enough.
We've already said.
One is enough.
I don't know how many times I have to say that this is wrong. We should not have deported anyone, and I don't believe anyone. I don't know of anyone who has been deported. But
You
we
wouldn't.
have deported
You wouldn't.
How many
You
times
wouldn't.
do I need to say that?
You wouldn't. You wouldn't know anyone that's been deported. You wouldn't.
I wouldn't know of any.
What
do you mean by that?
You wouldn't. Come on.
What do you mean by that?
You are not coming from the same place I'm coming from.
Listen,
you don't
listen.
represent the same people I represent.
Okay,
you would not know, and you don't care. Come on,
No, I
you
do
don't
care.
care.
No,
You
listen
don't
to me.
care. You don't care. It's a job for you. Yeah, it's a job for you. This is reality for me. When I leave here, my car can get pulled over for no reason. When I leave here and I go in, and it is true, when I go in a shop, or my daughter goes in a shop, who's 12, she gets followed around the
I
shop.
have to let Kwasi Kwarteng answer that because you've accused him of not caring.
Yeah.
Kwasi Kwarteng.
Look, of course we cared. We debated about this, and it's a national scandal. Everyone has said this. Even Alan Duncan, who is a government minister, said that he felt personal shame at what has happened. We've said this. But what I'm saying now is that everyone has a right to stay from the Windrush generation. The Prime Minister has reiterated that umpteen times now. She's spoken to Commonwealth leaders from the Caribbean who've come in to London this week, and we're trying to sort this out.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry to cut
Thank
you
you.
off there, but we must leave it. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us.
Home Office scandals tend to have a weird and extended life cycle. In the Windrush case, it started 5 years ago with a hardening of immigration policy. That created tragic problems for some people, but strangely, public attention barely registered the issues until the last few days when the whole ghastly business erupted in one go. Now we're in a new phase, a frantic partisan debate over who's to blame for the destruction of important records, the landing cards that said who arrived when. Theresa May pinned that decision down to Labour's period in office, but why are we arguing about it when she suggested that politicians probably didn't know about the landing cards anyway? The life cycle of this particular fiasco bears upon the future as well. What does it imply about the Home Office's ability to look after EU citizens here? Well, no one thinks the Home Office has shown Britain at its best, and this all at least invites a blame game between the politicians and those who have to administer their will. Here's Chris Cook.
Well, believe me, I am speaking broad-mindedly. I am glad to know my mother country.
Our state's callousness towards Windrush generation Britons seems boundless.
London is the place for me.
We knew about problems stemming from the government recently starting to ask them to prove their residence since before 1973. But we now know that landing cards, the government's log of their arrivals, were destroyed in 2010.
From 2010, the government's doing everything it could to cut immigration numbers, and a huge part of that was tackling illegal immigration. But in order to do that, they set up this task force to create what they called a hostile environment for anybody who didn't have exactly the right documents, forgetting, I think, that a huge number of people who are in the UK legitimately, the Windrush generation, and other Commonwealth migrants, don't have papers, and so they weren't able to prove their legitimate right to be in the country.
Arrivals at Tilbury.
In lots of cases, landing cards could have helped to ease the problem, identifying not just when people arrived in the UK, but also why.
Well, for the Windrush generation, what is crucial on there, for a start, it shows when they have arrived. It's obviously before the Immigration Act came in, and that meant people from the Commonwealth couldn't just come and settle. So it shows that they're here legitimately. On the back of the landing card should be information as to why they have arrived in the UK, which will be basically to work at the invitation of the British government. So these are very crucial pieces of information. And in the absence of any other information, any other documentation in the current situation, they are absolutely vital to those individuals who are now finding themselves under such stress.
Questions to the Prime Minister.
The decision to destroy the cards was taken by officials, not ministers. But this afternoon, it was a political football in the House of Commons.
Did the Prime Minister, the then Home Secretary, sign off that decision?
Prime Minister.
No, the decision to destroy the landing cards was taken in 2009 under a Labour government.
All of this has obviously been grim for the Windrush generation. But there may be other concerns for the future that it raises. Specifically, what will happen to EU nationals currently living in the UK after Brexit? You see, it's quite likely that after we leave the European Union, EU citizens who come after Brexit Day will have different rights to EU citizens who arrived in Britain before Brexit Day. And one big task for the states, the Home Office in particular, is going to be working out which people go into which group. And that's similar to what had to happen with the Windrush generation. The problem is that the Home Office has proved very bad at that administrative task, as well as heartless towards people who didn't keep the decades of paperwork required to help the Home Office make that determination.
So the Home Office will be going out of their way to design a system that is as easy to use as possible, and there are lots of positive stories about where they've got to so far. It draws on information from across government, it's light touch, it's digital, it's easy for applicants, and in the majority of cases that'll work well, but there could be hundreds of thousands of people from groups. They are either elderly, they don't know they need to apply, they may not want to apply, and for these people there's a real concern that they will come face to face with a sort of presumption of guilt that we have seen in some of the Windrush cases, and that could be a real problem.
The EU has previously noticed the Home Office's culture and has already sought to include provisions in the Brexit agreement to protect EU citizens from it.
Well, it definitely strengthens our resolve to make sure that there are watertight guarantees that whoever has resided in the United Kingdom or would have resided for decades in the United Kingdom, but also for who will have been residing in the European Union for decades, that their status will be settled.
Dealing with the Windrush scandal will require a change in approach for the Home Office, particularly the ease with which it comes to presume guilt. But they need to change that anyway, before they seek to deal with more than 3 million EU citizens.
Chris Cook, our policy editor there. We've asked the government to join us on this story the last 3 nights, but nobody's been available. The Home Office and its culture is at the centre of this, though. We'll debate how this has gone wrong shortly with a former head of the civil service and a defender of the tougher immigration controls. But everybody agrees that it is too easy in some abstract way to support a policy while forgetting what it actually means in real cases, which means we should keep reminding ourselves what the human effects have been. James Clayton's been talking to Clayton Barnes and his daughter. He's a Jamaican national who worked as a roofer. He lived here for half a century, had indefinite leave to remain, but unwittingly forfeited that when he retired to Jamaica, only to find he couldn't get back in, even to visit his family, despite having a UK pension.
Dad came to the UK around 1959, lived a full life, got married, had a house here, travelled back and forth to Jamaica just to sort of see family. He had an indefinite leave to remain in his passport, you know, a stamp in the passport, which he never ever had any problems with. He just used to come and go. With having a Jamaican passport and an indefinite leave to remain in it, there was really no need to have a British passport.
In 2010, Clayton retired to Jamaica, but when he wanted to return on a family trip, he was prevented from doing so.
The problem started in 2013. We thought he'd been back about 3 years in Jamaica and we hadn't seen him, so we thought we'd do a surprise visit from him coming to England and just doing a surprise visit at Christmas for my kids. Literally just booked the flights, sent him the details. As he checks in, they told him that he couldn't fly because his indefinite leave to remain was invalid.
Samantha says she'd been told that his indefinite leave to remain had expired, but as he was only going back to visit his relatives on a family holiday, they applied for a short stay visa. The response they got back shocked the family.
I've got that here. Yeah, that's this letter here. And it doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't really give what you call a valid reason, and it just states here, if I can read it, I'm not satisfied as to your intentions in wishing to travel to the UK now, and I am also not satisfied that you genuinely intend on a short visit only to the UK and will leave the UK at the end of your visit. He lived here for 51 years, paid his taxes, paid his national insurance. He was absolutely devastated. I mean, he could barely talk on the phone to me. He felt that he'd done something wrong, and I had to keep reassuring him that he hadn't done anything wrong. It does feel like he's been deported because he's not allowed back for no. And for me, the reasoning is not really a reason.
After another attempt in 2014, Clayton had had enough. He's not been back to the UK in 8 years. We spoke to him from his hospital bed in Jamaica about how he felt about his situation.
Horrible. Like cut up because I've been doing all these years, work with pension, you know what I mean? Income tax, everything, work hard, and now this.
Does it feel like you've been deported?
Yeah, because in a while I'd love to be deported. I haven't got no criminal record.
What would you say now to the Prime Minister, Theresa May? What would be your message to her?
So why can't I come back? Yeah, the reason why I can't come back. For why? I'd like to come back and see my family. I don't even know my grandkids perfectly. I only know one of them.
Clayton's health is deteriorating, and his family doesn't expect now that he'll ever come back to the country where he lived for most of his life.
It would have been nice for him to come back and just sort of like, just little things, even before he passes, to go, this is where, just have that memory as well, not just the memory of Jamaica, because this is his family life, this is where he got married, this is where he had kids, this is where he worked, so it is, I don't want him to die with that, just without that memory.
Well, another case in detail there. Tonight, the Home Office said its new Windrush helpline staff would offer to support Mr Barnes if he made contact with them. In a statement, the department said the Home Secretary had been clear the government didn't want people who had built their lives here in the UK to feel unwelcome. Well, joining me is Lord Kerslake, who was head of the Civil Service when the whole hostile environment policy was introduced. He's a crossbench peer who's done work for the Labour Party. And also with me is David Goodhart, the head of Demography, Immigration and Integration at the Policy Exchange think tank. Very good evening to you both. Lord Kerslake, I wonder if I can just start by asking you a few questions about some sort of narrow policy things. Landing cards. I know this was before, this was not when you were head of the Civil Service, at the time these landing cards were destroyed. Is it likely someone would have destroyed those without talking to a minister? Is it the kind of thing the guys on the ground would say, oh, that we can get rid of these, and there would have been a bit of discussion, or does that go into a red box?
Well, it's pretty unlikely that they would destroy records full stop, actually. There's quite a lot of care taken on these things, particularly if they're personal records. But the truth is we don't know, Evan. We need to investigate this in more detail to understand what happened. What we can say is that the Borders Agency was effectively part of the Civil Service, and it took its advice and direction from ministers.
From ministers, OK. So the jury's open on that one.
Yeah.
The hostile environment policy.
Yes.
So this is a point when you're running the Civil Service. Theresa May is Home Secretary and says we're going to have an Immigration Act 2014, and I want this to make life much tougher for illegal immigrants. Yeah. What was the advice? What were the Civil Service saying?
Well, I think it's worth starting with the story of how we got to this point, really. The Prime Minister, when he was in opposition, gave a commitment to reduce net migration to tens of thousands. When they came into office, it became pretty clear that that was damn near impossible, principally because, of course, net migration from Europe was the largest part of this. The consequence of that was really two things. One was to bear down pretty brutally on those who were not from Europe. So policy became pretty tough from those outside the European Union. And the second thing that happened was to ramp up the rhetoric and indeed the action in relation to those who were considered to be illegal immigrants. And the challenge really then was, how do you put that in practice? How do you do it quickly? How do you make an impact? And in truth, what we can see here is the effect of doing it in that way has led to some gruesomely unfair consequences for individuals.
I come back to the question, did the Civil Service say, Minister or Theresa May, don't do this because we don't know the difference between illegal immigrants and legal immigrants? And how are we going to distinguish between them? And that is the essence of the problem we're facing now.
Well, I think the Civil Service would have given advice on some of the challenges of the policies that were being taken forward here. They would have said there is a risk that you take action against those who are actually lawfully here because we don't have the
You're
information.
Speaking sort of hypothetically, did they say
Well,
that? Is your recollection that this was a kind of controversial policy? And people are saying, this is a really challenging policy, Home Secretary.
I think it was not just a question of the Home Secretary being told it was a challenging policy. The Prime Minister was as well, and this was a very contested piece of legislation across government departments. Now, I can't say, and shouldn't say, as the former head of the Civil Service, precisely who gave what advice to whom, but what I can tell you, it was highly contested. And there were some who saw it, I shan't name them, as almost reminiscent of Nazi Germany and the way it's working.
Sorry, some in the civil service?
No, some in the ministers were deeply unhappy.
Deeply unhappy at the policy?
Yeah.
But I come back to the point. Can the government now say this Windrush problem has exploded in our faces and we were not told about it by the experts we employ to run the Home Office?
Look, I don't think they can say that, really. Right. You created an environment in which action was going to be taken and there was a risk, it was obvious to everyone, that it may not. It would be. That you'd take the rough with the smooth. And I think it would be just quite wrong to land this on the civil service, basically. This was a conscious policy in order to hold on to a strong policy position that was proving very difficult to implement.
David Goodhart, do you think the policy to create a hostile environment was the right policy?
Obviously, it was the right policy. I mean, there's no point having a border if you do not enforce your border. That means you have to bear down on illegal immigration. I mean, I think with respect to what Bob was saying, I think he's certainly wrong about the... Look, clearly a very big mistake was made here when they introduced the so-called hostile environment. They should have been thinking about, are there batches of people out there kind of in history who may not be able to prove their right to residence here, and alarm bells should have rung, and I think that's probably that's a lack of institutional memory. It's left hand not knowing what right hand is doing, and clearly a very big and damaging mistake has been made. However, the bigger point here is that any country, any Home Office has to protect the country's border. The only thing wrong with the hostile environment policy is its awful name. What the hostile... the reason why we have to have this policy is not, as Bob said, because ministers aggressively want to reach this 100,000 target. The whole point about illegal immigrants, they do not show up in immigration statistics, so that is just complete nonsense. No. But the reason why this happened is because it was harder and harder, because we're a very liberal country. The legal and political protections make it very difficult to deport people in the normal way. So what happened was this... That Theresa May and Nick Timothy thought, look, what we need to do is make it more difficult for... We have a very big illegal immigration problem in this country. We have 1 million people who are here illegally.
Let me get back to Bob.
This is not a trivial problem.
Two or three points quickly to make here. First of all, the words matter here. If you talk about a hostile policy, it tells you what the intention is here. Have we talked about...
Yes, it's hostile to illegal immigration,
humane but properly delivered and competent would be a better way of looking at this, frankly. And other countries have exactly that sort of approach. So I think we've really got to think about the language here and what flows from the language. Second point I'd make here is that, of course, you have to manage migration and you have to deal with illegal immigrants. The point I was making was that the specific push that was driving this was the difficulties around net migration.
I've been out with enforcement teams, Home Office enforcement teams. By the way, the most ethnically mixed work group I've ever experienced in Britain. It was about 6 white British and it was about 6 Black and Asian Brits. It was and they think they're doing a good public service, and they are very aware of the fact that offenders can also be victims. I mean, this is, Theresa May's concern for the security of the border is linked up with her modern slavery agenda. They are very, very aware of the job they're doing, because people live in a limbo world. They're often subject to enormous exploitation. Bearing down on illegal immigration is an extremely important policy, and it must not be knocked off track by this horrendous mistake over the Windrush generation.
And the point I'm making is, of course, you have to deal with illegal immigration, and of course the staff do their job in the way they're asked to do it. The point I'm making here is a very different point here, is that the pressure in the system ramped up the rhetoric and ramped up the expectations.
But see, what I see the hostile environment being is the application of discretionary policies. There are meant to be discretionary policies. We expect these guys to see someone who's lived here, gets a British pension, and give them a tourist visa back in to visit their family. And it's the operation of that discretion, which seems to have been very binary. It was either soft touch, or then it went to sort of ludicrously unfair.
That
on
is a
lots of
completely
people.
different case, I think, the
one we've just
case,
seen.
the one that we've just seen. And it is, I think overall the Home Office is in a much better state now than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And 10 or 15 years ago, partly because we'd had a Labour government that had half opened the door, we'd had a huge increase in immigration. I think a lot of Labour ministers liked to blame the bureaucracy for the huge switch in policy.
But Bob Kerslake, that's what we're experiencing now.
Bob Kerslake, just a quick one. Amber Rudd said, she effectively laid it onto the Home Office. She said, too concerned with strategy and policy, not enough with individuals. What did you think of that?
I did feel that was completely ridiculous, I'm afraid. Exactly as David has said, these are staff who are doing the job they've been asked to do here. To simply say this was all down to an administrative issue is just wrong, really. And let's be very clear about this. You cannot create a climate and then not expect it to have consequences.
And what we do need, this problem would never have arisen if we'd had ID cards. We do actually have ID cards for all non-EU people who are here for 6 months or more, have BRPs, biometric residence permits. We should roll that out to the Europeans,
and then you can
that'll be
distinguish,
fine.
You can distinguish between. Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.